I'm here. How y'all doing? I'm Lady Rain. This is the Reader's Nook, and we are reading The Stand. We are reading chapter 35. We are reading Stand. Stephen King. There. It's in there. There. I want to read. I missed reading this morning. Chapter 35. I want to get out of the city, Rita said without turning around. She was standing on a small apartment balcony, the early morning breeze catching the diaphanous diaphanous nightgown she wore, flowing yards of material back through the sliding doors. All right, Larry said. He was sitting at the table, eating a fried egg sandwich. She turned to him, her face haggard. If she had looked an elegant 40 in the park the day he had met her, she now looked like a woman dancing on a chronological knife edge that separates the early 60s from the late. There was a cigarette between her fingers, and the tip trembled, making jitters of smoke. As she brought it to her lips and puffed without inhaling. I mean it, I'm serious. He used his napkin. I know you are, he said, and I can dig it. We have to go. Her facial muscles sagged into something like relief, and with an almost, but not quite, subconscious distaste, good Lord, Larry thought it made her look even older. When? Why not today? He asked. You're a dear boy, she said. Would you like more coffee? I can get it. Nonsense. You sit right where you are. I always used to get my husband a second cup. He insisted on it. Although I never saw more than his hairline at breakfast. The rest of him was behind the Wall Street Journal, or some dreadful heavy piece of literature. Something not just meaningful or deep, but positively gravid with meaning. Boyle, Camus, Milton, for God's sake. You're a welcome change. She looked back over her shoulder on the way to the kitchenette. Her expression was arch. It would be a shame to hide your face behind a newspaper. He smiled vaguely. Her wit seemed forced this morning, as it had all yesterday afternoon. He remembered meeting her in the park and how he had thought her conversation seemed like a careless spray of diamonds on the green felt of a billiard table. Since yesterday afternoon, it had seemed more like the glitter of zircons, near-perfect pastes that are, after all, only pastes. Here you are. She went to set the cup down, and her hand, still trembling, caused hot coffee to slop out onto the side of her forearm. He jerked back from her with an indrawn, feline hiss of pain. Oh, I'm sorry. Something more than consternation on her face. There was something there which could almost be terror. It's all right. No, it's just a cold rag. Don't. Just sit right there. Clumsy, stupid. She burst into tears, harsh cause escaping her, as if she had witnessed a messy death of her best friend instead of burning him slightly. He got to his feet and held her, and didn't much care for the convulsive way she hugged him in return. It was almost a clutch, cosmic clutch. New album by Larry Underwood, he thought unhappily. Oh, shit. You ain't no nice guy. Here we go again. I'm sorry. I don't know what's the matter with me. I'm never like this. I'm so sorry. It's all right. It's nothing. He went on soothing her automatically, brushing his hand over her salt and pepper hair. That would look so much better. All of her would look better, as a matter of fact, after she had put in some heavy time in the bathroom. Of course, he knew what part of the trouble was. It was both personal and impersonal. It had affected him too. But not so suddenly or deeply. With her, it was as if some internal crystal had shattered in the last 24 hours or so. And personally, I supposed it was the smell. It was coming in through the opening between the apartment living room and the balcony right now, riding the cool early morning breeze that would later give way to still, humid heat if the day was anything like the last 3 or 4. The smell was hard to define in any way that could be correct yet less painful than the naked truth. You could say it was like moldy oranges or spoiled fish or the smell you sometimes got in subway tunnels when the windows were open. None of them were exactly right. That is, that it was the smell of rotting people, thousands of them, decomposing in the heat, closed doors, in the heat behind closed doors, was putting it right. But you wanted to shy away from that. The power was still on in Manhattan, but Larry didn't think it would be for much longer. It had gone out in most other places already. Last night he had stood on the balcony after Rita was asleep, and from this high up you could see that the lights were out in better than half of Brooklyn and all of Queens. There was a dark pocket across 110th all the way to the end of Manhattan Island. Looking the other way, you could still see bright lights in Union City and maybe Bayonne, but otherwise New Jersey was black. The blackness meant more than the loss of lights. Among other things, it meant the loss of air conditioning, the modern convenience that made it possible to live in this particular hardcore urban sprawl after the middle of June. It meant that all the people who had died quietly in their apartments and tenements were now rotting in ovens. And whenever he thought of that, his mind returned to the thing he had seen in the comfort station on transverse number 1. He had dreamed about it, and in his dreams, that black, sweet treat came to life and beckoned him. On a more personal level, hi! He supposed she was troubled by what they had found when they walked down to the park yesterday. She had been laughing and chatting and gay when they started out. Coming back, she began to be old. The monster shouter had been lying on one of the paths in a huge pool of his own blood. His glasses lay, with both lenses shattered, beside his stiff and outstretched left hand. Some monster had been abroad, after all, apparently. The man had been stabbed repeatedly. To Larry's sickened eyes, he looked like a human pincushion. She had screamed and screamed, and when her hysteria had finally quieted, she insisted that they burn him. So they had. In going back to the apartment, she had been the woman he had found this morning. "It's all right," he said. "Just a little scald. The skin hardly red. I'll get the unguentine. Unguentine? Never heard of it. There's some in the medicine cabinet." She started away, and he grabbed her firmly by the shoulders and made her sit down. She looked at him from darkly circled eyes. What you're going to do is eat," he said. "Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee. Then we're going to get some maps and see what's the best way to get off Manhattan. We'll have to walk, you know." "Yes, I suppose we will." He went to the kitchenette, not wanting to look at the mute need in her eyes anymore, and got the last 2 eggs from the refrigerator. He cracked them in a bowl, tossed the eggshells in the disposal — I didn't know you could do that — and began to beat them. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. Which way?" he asked, with a touch of impatience. He added milk to the eggs and put the skillet back on the stove. "North? New England's that way. South? I don't really see the point of that. We could go—" A strangled sob. He turned and saw her looking at him, her hands wearing with each other in her lap, her eyes shiny. She was trying to control herself and having no luck. "What's the matter?" he asked, going to her. "What is it?" "I don't think I can eat," she sobbed. "I know you want me to. I'll try, but the smell." He crossed the living room, trundled the glass doors closed along the stainless steel tracks, then latched them firmly. There, he said lightly, hoping the annoyance he felt with her didn't show. Better? Yes, she said eagerly. That's a lot better. I can eat now. He went back to the kitchenette and stirred the eggs, which had begun to bubble. There was a grater in the utensil drawer, and he ran a block of American cheese along it, making a small pile that he sprinkled into the eggs. Behind him she moved, and a moment later, Debussy filled the apartment. Too light and pretty for Larry's taste. He didn't care for light classical music. If you were going to have classical shit, you ought to go whole hog and have your Beethoven or your Wagner or someone like that. Why fuck around? He had asked her in a casual manner what he did. She had asked him in a casual manner what he did for a living. A casual manner, he reflected with some resentment, of a person for whom anything so simple as a living had never been a problem. I was a rock and roll singer, he told her, slightly amazed at how painless that past tense was. Sing with this band for a while, then that one. Sometimes a studio gig. She had nodded, and that was the end of it. He had the urge to tell her about, baby, can you dig your man? That was the past now. The gap between that life and this was so large, he hadn't really comprehended it yet. In that life, he had been running away from the cocaine dealer. In this one,
I forgot to set a timer on this one.
He could bury a man in Central Park.
I keep forgetting to set timers.
It's all right, and accept them more or less as a matter of course. He put the eggs on a plate, added a cup of instant coffee.
Is this done? It's full burn on the side.
Yeah, it's done. It's done.
What is wrong with me?
Nothing. Added a cup of instant coffee with a lot of cream and sugar, the way she liked it.
What is right with me?
You're eating. Larry himself subscribed to the truck's credo of, if you wanted a cup of cream and sugar, why'd you ask for coffee? And brought it to the table. She was sitting on the hassock, holding her elbows and facing the stereo. Debussy strained out of the speakers like melted butter. Soup's on, he called. She came to the table with a wan smile, looked at the eggs the way a track and field runner might look at a series of hurdles, and began to eat. Good, she said. You were right, thank you. You're more than welcome, he said. Now look, what I'm going to suggest is this. We go down 5th to 39th and turn west.
Here's,
Oh, well, thank you. And turn west. Cross to New Jersey by the Lincoln Tunnel. We can follow 495 northwest to Passaic. And those eggs okay? They're not spoiled? She smiled. They're fine. She forked more into her mouth. Followed it.
Burners in the sink.
I didn't. Oh, I guess I did a little bit when I tried to look for the pizza cutter. Followed it with a sip of coffee. Just what I needed. Go ahead, I'm listening. From Passaic, we just ankle it west until the roads are clear enough for us to drive. Then I thought we could turn northeast and head up to New England. Make kind of a button hook. Do you see what I mean? It looks longer, but I think it'll save us a lot of hassles. Maybe take a house on the ocean in Maine, Kittery, York, Wells, Ongunquit. Maybe Scarborough or Booth Bay Harbor. How does that sound? He had been looking out the window, thinking as he spoke, and now he turned back to her. What he saw frightened him badly for a moment. It was as if she'd gone insane. She was smiling, but it was a rictus of pain and horror. Sweat stood out on her face in big round droplets. Rita? Jesus, Rita, what? Sorry. She scrambled up, knocking her chair over, and fled across the living room. One foot hooked the hassock, the hassock she had been sitting on and it rolled on its side like an oversized checker. She almost fell herself. Rita? Then she was in the bathroom, and he could hear the industrial grinding sound of her breakfast coming up. He slammed his hand flat on the table in irritation, then got up and went in after her. God, he hated it when people puked. It always made you feel like puking yourself. The smell of slightly used American cheese in the bathroom made him want to gag. Rita was sitting on the robin's egg blue tile of the floor, her legs folded under her, her head still hanging weakly over the bowl. She wiped her mouth with a swath of toilet paper and then looked up at him supplicantly, her face as pale as paper. I'm sorry. I just couldn't eat it, Larry. Really, I am so sorry. Well, Jesus, if you knew it was going to make you do that, why'd you try? Because you wanted me to. And I don't want you to be angry with me, but you are, aren't you? You are angry with me.
Mom, pizza!
Please stop yelling. His mind went back to last night. She had made love to him with such frantic energy, and for the first time he had found himself thinking of her age and had been a little disgusted. It had been like being caught in one of those exercise machines. He had come quickly, almost in self-defense it seemed. And a long while later she had fallen back, panting and unfulfilled. Later, while he was on the borderline of sleep, she had drawn close to him, and once again he was able to smell her sachet, a more expensive version of scent his mother had always worn when they went out to the movies. And she murmured the thing that had jerked him back from sleep and had kept him awake for another 2 hours. You won't leave me, will you? You won't leave me alone? Before that, she had been good in bed, so good that he was stunned. She had taken him back to this place after their lunch on the day they had met, and what had happened quite naturally. He remembered an instant of disgust when he saw how her breast sagged, and how the blue veins were prominent, and made him think of his mother's varicose veins. But he had forgotten all about that when her legs came up and her thighs pressed against his hips with amazing strength. Slow, she had laughed. The last shall be first and the first last. He had been on the verge when she had pushed him off and gotten cigarettes. The hell are you doing? He asked, amazed. While old John Thomas waved indignantly in the air, visibly throbbing. She had smiled. You've got a free hand, don't you? So do I. So they had done that while they smoked, and she chatted lightly about all matter of things. Although the color had come up in her cheeks, and after a while her breath had shortened, and what she was saying began to drift off, forgotten. Now, she said, taking his cigarette and her own and crushing them both out, let's see if you can finish what you started. If you can't, I'll likely tear you apart. He finished it quite satisfactorily for both of them, and they had slipped off to sleep. He woke up sometime after 4 and watched her sleeping, thinking there was something to be said for experience after all. He had done a lot of screwing in the last 10 years or so, but what had happened earlier hadn't been screwing. It had been something much better than that. It had been decadent. Well, she's had lovers, of course. This had excited him again, and he woke her up. And so it had been until they had found the monster shouter and last night. There had been other things before then, things that troubled him, but which he had accepted. Something like this, he had rationalized it. If it only makes you a little bit psycho, you're way ahead. 2 nights ago, he had awakened sometime after 2 and had heard her running a glass of water in the bathroom. Running a glass of water in the bathroom. He knew she was probably taking another sleeping pill. She had the big red and yellow, thought I saw something, gelatin capsules that were known as yellow jackets on the West Coast. Big downers. He told himself she'd probably been taking them long before the superfluid happened. And there was there was the way she followed him from place to place in the apartment too, even standing in the bathroom door, talking to him while he was showering or relieving himself. He was a private bathroom person, but he told himself that some weren't. A lot of it happened on your upbringing. He would have to talk with her sometime, but now, was he going to have to carry her on his back? Christ, he hoped not. She had seemed stronger than that. At least she had at first. It was one of the reasons she had appealed to him so strongly that day in the park. The main reason, really. There's no more truth in advertising, he thought bitterly. How the hell was he qualified to take care of her when he couldn't even watch out for himself? He'd shown pretty conclusively after the record had broken out. Wayne Stuckey hadn't been shy about pointing it out either. No, he told her, I'm not angry. It's just that, I'm not your boss. If you don't feel like eating, just say so. I told you. Said I didn't think I could. The fuck you did, he snapped, startled and angry. She bent her head and looked at her hands, and he knew she was struggling to keep from sobbing because he wouldn't like that. For a moment, it made him angrier than ever, and he almost shouted, I'm not your father or your fat cat husband. I'm not going to take care of you. You've got 30 years on me, for Christ's sake. Then he felt the familiar surge of self-contempt and wondered what the hell could be the matter with him. I'm sorry, he said. I'm an insensitive bastard. No, you're not, she said and sniffled. It's just that all of this is starting to catch up with me. Yesterday, that poor man in the park, I thought, no one is ever going to catch people who did that to him and put them in jail. They'll just go on and do it again and again, like animals in the jungle. And it all began to seem very real. Do you understand, Larry? Can you see what I mean? She turned her tear-wet eyes up to him. Yes, he said. And he was still impatient with her. But he was still impatient with her and just a trifle contemptuous. It was a real situation. How could it not be? They were in the middle of it and had watched it develop so far. His mother was dead. He had watched her die. And she was trying to say that she was somehow more sensitive to all this than he was. He had lost his mother, and she had lost the man who bought her Mercedes around. Oh, who brought her Mercedes around. But somehow her loss was supposed to be greater, or be the greater. Well, that was bullshit, just bullshit. Try not to be angry with me, she said. I'll do better. I hope so. I sure do hope so. You're fine, he said, and helped her to her feet. Come on now, what do you say? We got a lot to do. Feel up to it? Yes, she said. But her expression was the same as it had been when he offered her the eggs. When we get out of the city, you'll feel better. She looked at him nakedly. Will I? Sure, Larry said heartily. Sure you will. They went first cabin. Manhattan Sporting Goods was locked, but Larry broke a hole in the show window with a large iron pipe he had found. The burglar alarm brayed senselessly into the deserted street. He selected a large pack for himself and a smaller one for Rita. She had packed 2 changes of clothing for each of them. It was all he would allow. And he was carrying them in a Pan Am flight bag she had found in the closet, along with toothbrushes. The toothbrushes struck him as slightly absurd. Rita was fashionably attired for walking, in white silk deck pants and shell blouse. Larry, who wore faded blue jeans and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. They loaded the packs with freeze-dried foods and nothing else. There was no sense, Larry told her, in weighing themselves down with a lot of other stuff, including more clothes, when they could simply take what they wanted on the other side of the river. She agreed wanly, and her lack of interest nettled him again. I don't like allergies. After a short interior debate with himself, he also added a 30-30 and 200 rounds of ammunition. It was a beautiful gun, and the price tag he pulled from the trigger guard and dropped indifferently on the floor said $450. You really think we'll need that? She asked apprehensively. She still had the 32 in her purse. I think we'd better have it, he told her, not wanting to say more, but thinking about the monster shouter's ugly end. Oh, she said with a small voice, and he guessed from her eyes that she was thinking about that too. Pack's not too heavy for you, is it? Oh, no, it isn't, really. Well, they have a way of getting heavier as you walk along. You just say the word, and I'll carry it for a while. I'll be all right, she said, and smiled. After they were on the sidewalk again, she looked both ways and said, We're leaving New York. Yes. She turned to him. I'm glad. Feel like, when I was a little girl and my father would say, We're going on a trip today. You remember how that was? Larry smiled a little in return, remembering the evenings his mother would say, That Western you wanted to see is down at the Crest, Larry. Clint Eastwood, what do you say? I guess I do remember, he said. She stretched up on her toes and readjusted the pack a little bit on her shoulders. The beginning of the journey, she said, and then, so softly, he wasn't sure he'd heard her correctly. The way leads ever on. What? It's a line from Tolkien, she said, The Lord of the Rings. I've always thought of it as sort of a gateway to adventure. The less adventure, the better, Larry said. But almost unwillingly, he knew what she meant. Still, she was looking at the street. Near this intersection, it was the narrow canyon between high stone and stretches of sun-reflecting thermopane, clogged with cars backed up for miles. It was as if everyone in New York had decided at the same time to park in the streets. She said, I've been to Bermuda and England and Jamaica and Montreal and Saigon and to Moscow, but I haven't been on a journey since I was a little girl. My father took my sister Bess and me to the zoo. Let's go, Larry. It was a walk that Larry Underwood never forgot. He found himself thinking that she hadn't been so wrong to quote Tolkien at that. Tolkien with his mythic lands seen through the lens of time and half-mad, half-exalted images. Peopled with elves and ents and trolls and orcs. There were none of those in New York, but so much had changed, so much out of joint, that it was impossible not to think of it in terms of fantasy. A man hung from the lamppost at 5th and East 54th, below the park, and in one congested business district, a placard with a single word, looter, hung around his neck. A cat lying on top of a hexagonal little litter basket. The basket still had fresh-looking advertisements from the Broadway show on its sides, with her kittens, giving them suck and enjoying the mid-morning sun. A young man with a big grin and a valise strolled up to them, told Larry he would give him $1 million for the use of the woman for 15 minutes. The million, presumably, was in the valise. Larry unslung the rifle and told him to take his million elsewhere. Sure, man. Don't hold it against me, you dig it? Can't blame a guy for trying, can you? Have a nice day. Hang loose. They reached the corner of 50th and East 39th shortly after meeting that man. Rita, with a hysterical sort of good humor, insisted on referring to him as John Beresford Tipton, a name which meant nothing to Larry. It was nearly noon, and Larry suggested lunch. There was a delicatessen on the corner, and when he pushed the door open, the smell of rotted meat had come out, made her draw back. I better not go in there if I want to save what appetite I have, she said apathetically. Larry suspected he would find some cured meat inside, salami, pepperoni, something like that. But after running across John Beresford Tipton 4 blocks back, he didn't want to leave her alone for even a short time it would take to go in and check. So they found a bench halfway a block west and ate dehydrated fruit and dehydrated strips of bacon. They finished with cheese spread on Ritz crackers and passed a thermos of iced coffee back and forth. This time, I was really hungry, she said proudly. He smiled back, feeling better. Just to be on the move, to be taking some positive action, that was good. He had told her she would feel better when they got out of New York. At the time, it had just been something to say. Now, consulting the rise in his own spirits, he guessed it was true. Being in New York was like being in a graveyard where the dead were not yet quiet. The sooner they got out, the better it would be. She would perhaps revert to the way she had been the first day in the park. They would go to Maine on the secondary roads and set up housekeeping in one of those rich bitch summer houses. North now, south in September, October, Booth Bay Harbor in the summer, Key Biscayne in the winter. It had a nice ring, occupied with his thoughts. He didn't see her grimace of pain as he stood up and shouldered the rifle he had insisted on bringing. They were moving west now, their shadows behind them, at first as squat as frogs, beginning to lengthen out as the afternoon progressed. They passed the avenues of the Americas, 7th Avenue, 8th, 9th, 10th. The streets were crammed and silent, frozen rivers of automobiles in every color, predominated by the yellow of the taxicabs. Many of the cars had become hearses, their decaying drivers still leaning behind the wheels, their passengers slumped as if, weary of the traffic jam, they had fallen asleep. Larry started to think that maybe they'd want to pick up a couple of motorcycles once they got out of the city. That would give them both mobility and a fighting chance to skirt the worst of the clots of dead vehicles, which might litter the highways everywhere. Always assuming she could ride a bike, he thought. And the way things were going, it would turn out she couldn't. Life with Rita was turning out to be a real pain in the butt, at least in some of its aspects, but if push came to shove, he supposed she could ride pillion behind him. At the intersection of 39th and 7th, they saw a young man wearing cut-off denim shorts and nothing else lying atop a ding-dong taxi. Is he dead? Rita asked. And at the sound of her voice, the young man sat up, looking around, saw them, and waved. They waved back. The young man lay placidly back down. It was just after 2 o'clock when they crossed 11th Avenue. Larry heard a muffled cry of pain behind him and realized Rita was no longer walking on his left. She was down on one knee, holding her foot. With something like horror, Larry noticed for the first time that she was wearing expensive, open-toed sandals, probably in the $80 range. Just the thing for a 4-block stroll along Fifth Avenue without window shopping, but for a long walk, a hike, really, like the one they were going to be making. The ankle straps had chafed through her skin. Blood was trickling down her ankles. Larry, I'm sorry. He jerked her abruptly to her feet. What were you thinking about? He shouted into her face. He felt a moment's shame at the miserable way she recoiled, and also a mean sort of pleasure. Did you think you could cab back to your apartment if your feet got tired? I never thought, well, Christ, he ran his hands along his hair. I guess you didn't. You're bleeding, Rita. How long has it been hurting? Her voice was so low and husky that he had trouble hearing her even in the preternatural silence. Since about 5th and 49th, I guess. Your feet have been hurting you for 20 fucking blocks and you didn't say anything? I thought it might go away, not hurt anymore. I didn't want to. We were making such good time getting out of the city. I just thought. You didn't think at all, he said angrily. How much good time are we going to make with you like this? Your fucking feet look like you got fucking crucified. Don't swear at me, Larry, she said, beginning to sob. Please don't. It makes me feel so bad when you... Please don't swear at me. He was in an ecstasy of rage now, and later, he would not be able to understand why the sight of her bleeding feet had blown all his circuits that way. For the moment, it didn't matter. He screamed into her face. Fuck, fuck, fuck. The word echoed back from the high-rise apartment buildings, dim and meaningless. She put her hands over her face and leaned forward, crying. It made him even angrier, and he supposed that part of it was that she really didn't want to see. She would just as soon put her hands over her face and let him lead her. Why not? There'd always been someone around to take care of old heroine little Rita. Someone to drive the car, do the marketing, wash out the toilet bowl, do the taxes. So, let's put on some of that gagging sweet Debussy and put our well-manicured hands over our eyes and leave it all up to Larry. Take care of me, Larry, after seeing what happened to the monster shouter. I decided I don't want to see any more. It's all rather sordid. Of one of my breeding and background. For one of my breeding and background. What? You were already there. You are fine. He yanked her hands away. She cringed and tried to put them over her eyes again. Look at me. She shook her head. God damn it, you look at me, Rita. She finally did in a strange, flinching way, as if thinking he would now go to work on her with his fists as well as his tongue. The way a part of him felt now, that would be just fine. I want to tell you the facts of life because you don't seem to understand them. The fact is, we may have to walk another 20, or 30 miles. Yeah, you don't get that. The fact is, if you get infected from those scrapes, you could get blood poisoning and die. The fact is, you got to get your thumb out of your ass and start helping me. He had been holding her by the upper arms, and he saw that his thumbs had almost disappeared into her flesh. His anger broke when he saw the red marks that appeared when he let her go. He stepped away, feeling uncertain now, knowing with sick certainty that he had overreacted. Larry Underwood strikes again. If he was so goddamn smart, why hadn't he checked out her footgear before they started out? Because that's her problem. Part of him said with surely defensiveness. No, that wasn't true. It had been his problem, because she didn't know if he was going to take her with him. And it was only today that he had begun to think how much simpler life would be if he hadn't. He was just going to have to be responsible for her. Be damned if I will, the Shirley voice said. His mother. You're a taker, Larry. The oral hygienist from Fordham, crying out her window after him. I thought you were a nice guy. You ain't no nice guy. There's something left out of you, Larry. You're a taker. That's a lie. You're a goddamn lie. That's a goddamn lie. Rita, he said, I'm sorry. She sat down on the pavement with her sleeveless blouse and her white deck pants, her hair looking gray and old. She bowed her head and held her hurt feet. She wouldn't look at him. I'm sorry, he repeated. Look, I have no right to say those things. He did, but never mind. You apologized, things got smoothed over. It was how the world worked. Go on, Larry. Don't let me slow you down, she said. I said I was sorry, he told her, his voice a trifle petulant. We'll get you some new shoes, some white socks. We'll nothing. Go on. Rita, I'm sorry. If you say that one more time, I'll scream. You're a shit, and your apology is not accepted. Now go on. I said I was... She threw her head back and shrieked. He took a step backward, looking around to see if anyone had heard her, to see if maybe a policeman was running over to see what kind of awful thing that young fellow was doing to the old lady who was sitting on the sidewalk with her shoes off. Culture lag, he thought distractedly. What? What fun is it? What fun it all is. What? 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 I'm reading. I'm trying to anyway. You're not letting me. Ugh. Fine, I'll just cut you. Stop hitting my desk, though, because then my lappy goes blah, 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 blah. She stopped screaming and looked at him. She made a flickering gesture with her hand, as if he was a bothersome fly. You better stop, he said, or I really will leave you. She only looked at him. He couldn't meet her eyes and so dropped his gaze, hating her for making him do that. All right, he said. Have a good time getting raped and murdered. He shouldered the rifle and started off again, now angling left toward the car-packed 495 entrance ramp, sloping down toward the tunnel's mouth. At the foot of the ramp, he saw there had been one hell of a crash. A man driving a Mayflower moving van had tried to butt his way into the main traffic flow, and cars were scattered around the van like bowling pins. A burnout Pinto lay almost beneath the van's body. The van's driver hung halfway out of the cab window, head down, arms dangling. There was a fan of dried blood and puke sprayed out below him on the door. Larry looked around, sure he would see her walking toward him or standing and accusing him with her eyes. But Rita was gone. Fuck you, he said with nervous resentment. I tried to apologize. For a moment he couldn't go on. He felt impaled by hundreds of angry dead eyes, staring out at him from all those cars. A snatch of Dylan occurred to him. I waited for you inside the frozen traffic when you knew I had some place to be. But where were you tonight, sweet Marie? What? What? You were out already. You were just out an hour ago. Ahead, he could see 4 lanes of westbound traffic disappearing into the black arch of the tunnel, and with something like real dread, he saw that the overhead fluorescent bars inside the Lincoln Tunnel were out. It would be like going into an automobile graveyard. They would let him get halfway, and then they would all begin to stir, to come alive. Come here. He would hear car doors clicking open and then softly chunking closed. There's shuffling footsteps. They're going to be zombies. A light sweat broke on his body. Okay. I was late. Okay. They would let him get... Nope. Shuffling footsteps. A light sweat broke on his body. Overhead, a bird called graciously, and he jumped. You're being stupid, he told himself. Kid stuff. That's what this is. All you have to do is stay on the pedestrian catwalk, and in no time at all, you'll be strangled by the walking dead. He licked his lips and tried to laugh. It came out badly. He walked 5 paces toward the place where the ramp joined the highway, and then stopped again. To his left was a caddy, an Eldorado, and a woman with a blackened troll face was staring out at him. Her nose was pressed into a bulb against the glass. Blood and snot had trickled out onto the window. The man who had been driving the caddy had slumped over the wheel, as if looking for something on the floor. All the caddy's windows were rolled up. It would be like a greenhouse in there. If he opened the door, the woman would spill out and break open on the pavement like a sack of rotten melons. The smell would be warm and steamy, wet and crawly with decay. The way it would smell in the tunnel. Abruptly, Larry turned around, trotted back the way he had come, feeling a breeze. He was making cool sweat. The breeze he was making cool the sweat on his forehead. Rita, listen, I want to... The words died as he reached the top of the ramp. Rita was still gone. 39th Street dwindled away to a point. He ran from the south sidewalk to the north, squeezing between bumpers and scrambling over hoods, almost hot enough to blister his skin. But the north sidewalk was also empty. He cupped his hands around his mouth and cried, "Rita, Rita!" His only answer was a dead echo, "Rita, Ida, Ida, Ida." By 4 o'clock, dark clouds had begun to build over Manhattan, and the sound of thunder rolled back and forth between the city's cliffs. "Stop that! You ate! Or you were outside an hour ago." Lightning forked down at the buildings. It was as if God were trying to frighten the few remaining people out of hiding. The light had become yellow and strange, and Larry didn't like it. His belly was cramped, and when he lit a cigarette, it trembled in his hand, the way the coffee cup had trembled in Rita's this morning. "Stop that! You're not going in there." "No. You have a bone." He was sitting at the street end of the access ramp, leaning his back against... "Stop! Don't you dare. You were just out an hour ago. You are not going back. You can wait. We're not playing this game." Leaning his back against the lowest bar of the railing, his pack was on his lap. "I'm gonna put you in bed." And the 30-30 was leaning against the railing beside him. He had thought she would get scared and come back before long, but she hadn't. 15 minutes ago, he had given up calling her name. The echoes freaked him out. Thunder rolled again, close this time. Chilly breeze ran its hand over the back of his shirt, which was pasted to his skin with sweat. He was going to have to get inside somewhere, or else stop shitting around and go through the tunnel. If he couldn't work up the guts to go through, he'd have to spend another night in the city and go over the George Washington Bridge in the morning. And that was 140 blocks north. He tried to think rationally about the tunnel. There was nothing in there that was going to bite him. He'd forgotten to pick up a good old flashlight. Christ, you never remembered everything. But he did have his butane Bic. There was a guide rail along the catwalk and the road. Anything else? Thinking about all those dead people in their cars, for instance? That was just panic talking. Comic book stuff. About as sensible as worrying about the boogeyman in your closet. That's all you can think about. "Larry," he lectured himself, "then you're not going to get along in this brave new world. Not at all. You're..." A stroke of lightning split the sky almost directly overhead, making him wince. It was followed by a heavy caisson of thunder. He thought randomly, July 1st. This is the day you're supposed to take your sweetie to Coney Island and eat hot dogs by the score. Knock down the 3 wooden milk bottles and one ball and win the Cupid doll. Fireworks at night. A cold splash of rain struck the side of his face, and then another hit the back of his neck, trickled down the collar of his shirt. Dime-sized drops began to hit around him. He stood up, slung the pack over his shoulders, and hoisted the rifle. He was still not sure which way to go. Back to 39th or into the Lincoln Tunnel. But he had to get under cover somewhere, because it was starting to pour. Thunder broke overhead with a gigantic roar, making him squeal in terror. A sound no different than those made by Cro-Magnon men 2 million years before. "You fucking coward," he said, and trotted down the ramp toward the maw of the tunnel. His head beat forward as the rain began to come harder. It dripped from his hair. The heck? I don't even know. He passed a woman with her nose against the Eldorado's passenger window, trying not to look, but catching her out of the tail of his eye just the same. The rain drummed on the car roofs, like jazz percussion. It was coming down so hard, it bounced back up again, causing a light mist haze. Hey! Excuse you, that's mine. Really? Is Nick down here? Tristan down here? Oi. Get down. Get down. That is mine. You have this. There. That is my slipper. She's eating my unicorn slipper. What? Larry stopped for a moment, just outside the tunnel, undecided and frightened again. Then it began to hail, and that decided him. The hailstones were big, stinging. Thunder bellowed again. Okay, he thought, okay, I'm convinced. He stepped into the Lincoln Tunnel. It was much blacker inside than he had imagined it would be. At first, the opening behind him cast dim white light light ahead, and he could see yet more cars jammed bumper to bumper. It must have been bad dying in here, thought, as claustrophobia wrapped its stealthy banana fingers lovingly around his head and began to first caress and then squeeze his temples. It must have been really bad. Must have been fucking horrible. And the white tiles that dressed the upward curving walls. You could see, that is enough. Stop that. He could see the pedestrian railing to his right, stretching dimly ahead. On his left, or 30 or 40 foot at 30 or 40 foot intervals, were big support pillars. A sign advertised him, "Do not change lanes." There was dark fluorescence embedded in the tunnel's roof, and the dark glass eyes of closed-circuit TV cameras as he negotiated the first slow, banked curve. Bearing gently to the right, the light grew dimmer until all he could see were muted flashes of chrome. After that, the light simply ceased to exist at all. He fumbled out his Bic, held it up, spun the wheel. The light it provided was pitifully small, feeding his unease rather than assuaging it. Even with the flame turned up all the way, it only gave him a circle of visibility about 6 feet in diameter. That's actually pretty decent when you're walking, but not really. He put it back in his pocket and kept walking, trailing his head lightly along the railing, his hand lightly along the railing. There was an echo in here too, one he liked even less than the one outside. The echo made it sound like someone was behind him, stalking him. He stopped several times, head cocked, eyes wide, but blind, listening until the echo had died off. After a bit, he began to shuffle again, not lifting his heels from the concrete so the echo wouldn't recur. Sometime after he had stopped again, flicked the light close to his wristwatch. It was 4:20, but he wasn't sure what to make of that. It was blackness time. In this blackness, time seemed to have no objective meaning, neither did distance for that matter. How long was Lincoln Tunnel anyway? A mile? 2? Surely it couldn't be 2 miles under the Hudson River. Let's say a mile. But if a mile was all it was, it should have been at the other end already. If the average man walks 4 miles an hour, he could walk 1 mile in 15 minutes. He'd already been in the stinking hole 5 minutes longer than that. "I'm walking a lot slower," he said, and jumped at the sound of his own voice. The lighter dropped from his hand and clicked onto the catwalk. The echo spoke back, changing into the dangerously jocular voice of an approaching lunatic. "Lot slower, lower, lower. Jesus, Larry muttered, and the echo whispered back, Zeus, Zeus, Zeus. He wiped a hand across his face, fighting panic and the urge to give up thought, and just ran blindly forward. Instead he knelt, his knees propped like a pistol shot's, frightening him again, and walked his fingers over the miniature topography of the pedestrian catwalk. The chipped valleys in the cement, the ridge of an old cigarette butt, the hill of a tiny tinfoil ball, until at last he happened on his Vic. With an inner sigh, he squeezed it tightly in his hand, stood up, and walked on. Larry was beginning to get himself under control again when his foot struck something stiff and barely yielded. He uttered an inhalatory sort of scream, took 2 staggering steps backward. He made himself hold steady as he pulled the big lighter from his pocket and flicked it. The flame wavered crazily in his trembling grasp. He had stepped on a soldier's hand. He was sitting with his back against the tunnel wall, his legs splayed across the walkway. A horrible sentinel left here, the bar passage. His glazed eyes stared up at Larry. His lips had fallen away from his teeth, and he seemed to be grinning. A switchblade knife jutted jauntily from his throat. Ooh. The lighter was growing warm in his hand. Larry let it go out, licked his lips, holding the railing in a death grip, and forced himself forward until the toe of his shoe struck the soldier's hand again. Then he stepped over, making a comically large stride. And what are you eating? What are you eating? Better not be eating anything. A kind of nightmarish certainty came over him. He could hear the scrape of the soldier's boots as he shifted. And then the soldier, which reached out and grasped his leg in a loose, cold grip. In a shuffling sort of run, Larry went another 10 paces and then made himself stop, knowing that if he didn't stop, the panic would win and he would bolt blindly, chased by a terrible regiment of echoes. When he felt he had himself under some sort of control, he began to walk again. Ugh, it's either cold or yawn. Grief. He began to walk again. But now it was worse. His toes shrank inside his shoes, afraid that at any second they might come in contact with another body sprawled on the catwalk. And soon enough it happened. He groaned and fumbled the lighter out again. This time it was much worse. The body his foot had struck was that of an old man in a blue shirt. The black silk skullcap had fallen from his balding head into his lap. There was a 6-pointed star of beaten silver on his lapel. Beyond him were another 6 corpses, 2 women, a man of middle age, a woman who might have been in her late 70s, and 2 teenage boys. The lighter was growing too hot to hold any longer. He snapped it off, slipped it back in his pants pocket, where it glowed like a warm coal against his leg. Captain Trips hadn't taken this group off any more than it had taken the soldier back there. He had seen the blood, the torn clothes, the chipped tiles, the bullet holes. They had been gunned down. Larry remembered the rumors that soldiers had blocked off the points of exit from Island Manhattan. He hadn't known whether to believe them or not. He had heard so many rumors last week as things were breaking down. The situation here was easy enough to reconstruct. They had been caught in the tunnel, but they hadn't been too sick to walk. They got out of their car and began to make their way toward the Jersey side. Using the catwalk, just as he was doing. There had been a command post, machine gun, complacent something, had been, or was now. Larry stood sweating, trying to make up his mind. The solid darkness provided the perfect theater screen on which the mind could play out its fantasies. It must have been. He saw grim-eyed soldiers in germ-proof suits crouched behind a machine gun equipped with an infrared peeper scope, their job to cut down any stragglers who tried to come through the tunnel. One single soldier left behind, a suicide volunteer, wearing infrared goggles and creeping toward him with a knife in his teeth. Two soldiers quietly loading a mortar with a single poison gas canister. Yet he couldn't bring himself to go back. He was quite sure that those imaginings were only vapors, and the thought of retracing his steps was insupportable. Surely the soldiers were gone now. The dead one he'd stepped over seemed to support that, but what was really troubling him, he supposed, was the bodies directly ahead. They were sprawled all over each other for 8 or 9 feet. He couldn't just step over them as he had stepped over the soldier, and if he went off the catwalk to go around them, he risked breaking his leg or his ankle. If he was to go on, he would have to walk over them. Behind him in the darkness, something moved. Larry wheeled around, instantly engulfed in the fear that a single gritting sound. Footstep. "Who's there?" he shouted, unslinging his rifle. No answer but the echo. When it faded, he heard, or thought he did, the quiet sound of breathing. He stood bug-eyed in the dark, the hairs along the nape of his neck turning into hackles. He held his breath. There was no sound. He was beginning to dismiss it as imagination when the sound came again, a sliding, quiet footstep. He fumbled madly for his lighter. The thought that it would make him a target never occurred to him. As he pulled it from his pocket, the striker wheel caught in the lining momentarily, and the lighter tumbled from his hand. He heard a click as it struck the railing, and then there was a soft bonk as it struck the hood or trunk of a car below. The sliding footstep came again, a little closer now, possible to tell how close. Someone coming to kill him? And his terror-locked mind gave him a picture of a soldier with a switchblade in his neck. The picture of the soldier with a switchblade in his neck, moving slowly toward him in the dark. A soft, gritting step again. Larry remembered the rifle. He threw the butt against his shoulder and began to fire. The explosions were shatteringly loud in the closed space. He screamed at the sound of them. The scream was lost in the roar. Flashbulb images of tile and frozen lanes of traffic exploded one after another like a string of black and white snapshots as fire licked from the muzzle of the 30-30. Ricochets whined like banshees. The gun whacked his shoulder again and again, until it was numb, until he knew that the force of the recoils had turned him on his feet, and he was shooting out over the roadway instead of back along the catwalk. He was still unable to stop. His finger had taken over the function of the brain, and it spasmed mindlessly until the hammer began to fall in a dry and impotent clicking sound. The echo rolled back, right after images hung before his eyes in triple exposures. He was faintly aware of the stench of cordite and of the whining sound he was making deep in his chest. Still, clutching the gun, he whirled around again, and now it was not the soldiers in his sterile Andromeda strain suits that he saw on the screen of the interior theater, but the Morlocks from the classic comics version of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. Humped and blind creatures coming out of their holes in the ground where engines ran on in the bowels of the earth. He began to struggle across. Thank you. Hello. I know, isn't she a beauty? She's a pain in my butt, though. But she's cute. Yeah. No, why? Okay. He began to struggle across the soft yet stiff barricade of bodies, stumbling. Thank you. Almost falling, clutching the railing, going on. His foot punched through into some dreadful sliminess. There was a gassy, putrid smell that he barely noticed. He went on gasping. Then, from behind him, a scream rose in the darkness, freezing him on the spot. It was a desperate, wretched sound, close to the limits of sanity. Larry! Oh, Larry, for God's sake! It was Rita Blakemore. He turned around. There was sobbing now, wild sobbing that filled the place with fresh echoes. From one wild moment, he decided to go on anyway to leave her. She would find her way out eventually. Why burden himself with her again? Then he got hold of himself and shouted, Rita, stay where you are. Do you hear me? The sobbing continued. He stumbled back across the bodies, trying not to breathe, his face twisted in an expression of grimacing disgust. Then he ran toward her, not sure how far he had to go because of the distorting quality of the echo. In the end, he almost fell over her. Larry? She threw herself against him and clutched his neck with a strangler's force. He could feel her heart skidding along at a breakneck pace under her shirt. Larry, Larry, don't leave me alone here. Don't leave me alone in the dark. No, he held her tightly. Did I hurt you? Are you shot? No, I felt the wind. One of them went by so close I felt the wind of it. And chips, tile chips, I think, on my face, cut my face. Oh, Jesus, Rita, I didn't know. I was freaking out in here, the dark. I lost my lighter. You should have called. I could have killed you. The truth of it came home to him. I could have killed you. He repeated it, in stunned revelation. I wasn't sure it was you. I went into an apartment house when you went down the ramp, and you came back and called, and but I couldn't. And then two men came after the rain started. I think they were looking for us, or just for me. So I stayed where I was, and when they were gone, I thought, maybe they're not gone. Maybe they're hiding, looking for me. And I didn't dare go out until I started to think you'd get to the other side. I'd just see you again. I'd never see you again. So Larry, you won't leave me, will you? You won't go away? No, he said. I was wrong in what I said. Well, that was wrong. You were right. I should have told you about the sandals. I mean, the shoes. I'll eat what you tell me to. Oh. Shush, she told her. He said, holding her. It's all right now. All right. But in his mind, he was seeing himself firing at her in a blank panic, and thought how easily one of those slugs could have slammed her arm or blown out her stomach. Suddenly, he had to go to the bathroom very badly, and his teeth. You've got to stop pushing on my leg, 'cause you're gonna push the leg of this thing, and it's gonna tip over. I'm literally holding the leg so that she doesn't move it, because if not, my desk is gonna go. Psh. His teeth wanted to chatter. We'll go when you feel like you can walk. Take your time. There was a man. I think it was a man. I stepped on him, Larry. She swallowed and her throat clicked. Oh, I almost screamed then, but I didn't, because I thought it might be one of those men up ahead instead of you. And when you called out the echo, I couldn't tell if it was you or there are more dead people up ahead. Can you stand that? If you're with me, please, if you're with me. I will be. Let's go then. I want to get out of here. She shuddered convulsively against him. I never wanted anything so badly in my life. He felt for her face and kissed her, not first her nose, and then each eye, and then her mouth. Thank you, he said humbly, having not the slightest idea what he meant. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, she repeated. Oh, dear Larry. You won't leave me, will you? No, he said. I won't leave you. Just tell me when you feel like you can, Rita, and we'll go together. When she felt she could, they did. She's just going to lay here. No, like, right there. As long as she doesn't move, my table leg won't move. We're working on something to keep it, like, locked, but at the moment, I just have to keep the legs from moving. They got over the bodies, their arms slung about each other's necks, like drunken chums coming home from a neighborhood tavern. Beyond that, they came to a blockage of some sort. It was impossible to see, but after running her hands over it, Rita said it might be a bed standing on end. Together they managed to tip it over the catwalk railing, and crashed onto a car below with a loud, echoing bang that made them both jump and clutch each other. Behind where it had been, there was more sprawled bodies, three of them, and Larry guessed that these were the soldiers that had shot down the Jewish family. They got over them and went on, holding hands. A short time later, Rita stopped short. What's the matter? Larry asked. Is there something in the way? No, I can see, Larry. It's the end of the tunnel. He blinked and realized that he could see too. The glow was dim and it had come so gradually that he hadn't been aware of it until Rita had spoken. He could make out a faint shine on the tiles and the pale blur of Rita's face closer by. Looking over to the left, he could see the dead river of automobiles. Come on, he said jubilant. 60 paces further along, there were more bodies sprawled on the walkway, all soldiers. They stepped over them. Why would they only close off New York? She asked. Unless maybe, Larry, maybe it only happened in New York? I don't think so, he said, but felt a touch of irrational hope anyway. They walked faster. The mouth of the tunnel was ahead of them now. It was blocked by two huge army convoy trucks parked nose to nose. The trucks blotted out much of the daylight, as if they hadn't been there. Larry and Rita would have had some light much farther back in the tunnel. There was another sprawl of bodies where the catwalk descended to join the ramp leading outside. They squeezed between the convoy trucks, scrambling over the locked bumpers. Rita didn't look inside, but Larry did. There was a half-assembled tripod machine gun, boxes of ammunition, and canisters of stuff that looked like tear gas. Also 3 dead men. As they came outside, a rain-dampened breeze pressed against them, and its wonderfully fresh smell seemed to make it all worthwhile. He said so to Rita, and she nodded and put her head against his shoulder for a moment. I wouldn't go through there again for $1 million, though, she said. In a few years, you'll be using money for toilet paper, he said. Please don't squeeze the greenbacks. But are you sure that it wasn't just New York, he pointed. Look, the toll booths were empty. The middle one stood in a heap of broken glass. Beyond them, the westbound lanes were empty as far as they could see. But the eastbound lanes, the one which fed into the tunnel in the city they had just left, were crowded with silent traffic. There was an untidy pile of bodies in the breakdown lane, and a number of seagulls stood watch over it. Oh, dear God, she said weakly. There are as many people trying to get into New York as there were trying to get out of it. I don't know why they bothered blockading the tunnel on the New Jersey end. Probably they didn't know why either, just somebody's bright idea, busy work. But she had sat down on the road and was crying. Don't, he said, kneeling beside her. The experience in the tunnel was still too fresh for him to feel angry with her. It's all right, Rita. Was it? What is? She sobbed. What is? Just tell me one thing. We're out, anyway. That's something. And there's fresh air. In fact, New Jersey never smelled so good. Tickle in my throat. That earned him a wan smile. Larry looked at the scratches on her cheek and temple where the shards of tile had cut her. We had to get you to a drugstore and put some peroxide on those cuts, he said. Do you feel up to walking? Yes. She was looking at him with a dumb gratitude that made him feel uneasy. And I'll get some new shoes, some sneakers. I'll do just what you tell me, Larry. I want to. I shouted at you because I was upset, he said quietly. He brushed her hair back and kissed one of her scratches over her right eye. I'm not such a bad guy, he said quietly. Just don't leave me. He helped her to her feet and slipped an arm around her waist. Then they walked slowly toward the toll booths and slipped through them. New York behind them, and crossed the river. I don't know if we can get through this. I mean, we might be able to. Just don't know. Because I gotta leave. Oh yeah, we'll be able to get through it because it's taken us, oh, I don't know. It's taken us an hour and a half. Well, an hour 20. I'll read as much as I can until 9 o'clock. How about that? And if I can get through 36 before 9 o'clock, we'll be doing good. Chapter 36. There was a small park in the center of Ogunquit, complete with Civil War cannon and a war memorial. And after Gus Dinsmore died, Franny Goldsmith went there and sat beside the duck pond, idly throwing stones in and watching the ripples spread in the calm water until they reached the lily pads around the edges and broke up in confusion. She had taken Gus to the Hanson house down on the beach the day before yesterday, afraid that if she waited any longer, Gus wouldn't be able to walk and would have to spend his final confinement, as her ancestors would have termed it, with such grisly yet apt euphemism, in his hot little cubicle near the public beach parking lot. She had thought Gus would die that night. His fever had been high, and he had been crazily delirious, falling out of bed twice, even staggering around old Mr. Hanson's bedroom, knocking over things over, falling to his knees, getting up again. He cried out to people who were not there, answered them, and watched them with emotions varying from hilarity to dismay, until Franny began to feel that Gus's invisible companions were the real ones and she was the phantom. She had begged Gus to get back into bed, but for Gus, she wasn't there. She had to keep stepping out of his way. If she hadn't, he would have knocked her over and walked over her. At last, he had fallen onto the bed and had passed from energetic delirium to a gasping, heavy-breathing unconsciousness that Fran supposed was the final coma. But the next morning, when she looked in on him, Gus had been sitting up in bed and reading a paperback. Western had been found. A Western he had found in on one of the shelves. He thanked her for taking care of him and told her earnestly that he hoped he hadn't said or done anything embarrassing the night before. When she said he hadn't, Gus had looked doubtfully around the wreckage of the bedroom and told her she was good to say so anyway. She made some soup, which he ate with gusto, and when he complained of how hard it was to read without his spectacles, which had been broken while he had been taking his turn on the barricade of the south end of the town the week before, she had taken the paperback over his weak protests and had read him 4 chapters in a Western by a woman who lived up north in Haven. Rimfire Christmas, it was called. Sheriff John Stoner was having problems with the rowdier element in the town of Roaring Rock, Wyoming, it seemed, and worse, he just couldn't find anything to give his lovely young wife for Christmas. Rand had gone away more optimistic, thinking that Gus might be recovering, but last night he had gotten worse again, and he had died at 7:45 this morning, only an hour and a half ago. He had been rational at the end, but unaware of just how serious his condition was. He had told her longingly that he'd like to have an ice cream soda, the kind his daddy had treated Gus and his brothers to every 4th of July, and again at Labor Day, when the fair came to Bangor. But the power was off in Ogunquit by then. It had gone at exactly 9:17 p.m. on the evening of the 28th by the electric clocks, and there was no ice cream to be had in town. She had wondered if someone in town might not have a gasoline generator with a freezer hooked up to it on an emergency circuit, and even thought of hunting up Harold Lauder to ask him. But then Gus began to breathe his final, whooping, helpless breaths. That went on for 5 minutes, while she held his head up with one hand and a cloth under his mouth with the other to catch the thick expectorations of mucus. Then it was over. Granny covered him with a clean sheet, had left him on old Jack Hanson's bed, which overlooked the ocean. Then she had come here, and since then had been skipping rocks across the pond, not thinking about much of anything, but she unconsciously realized that it was a good kind of not thinking. It wasn't like the strange apathy that had shrouded her on the day after her father had died. Since then she had been more and more herself. She had gotten a rose bush down at Nathan's house of flowers and had carefully planted it at the foot of Peter's grave. She thought it would take real well, as her father would have said. Her lack of thought now was the kind of rest, after seeing Gus through the last of it. It was nothing like the prelude to madness she had gone through before. That had been like passing through some gray, foul tunnel full of shapes more sensed than seen. It was a tunnel she never wanted to travel again. But she would have to think soon about what to do next, and she supposed that thinking would have to include Harold Lauder. Not just because she and Harold were now the last two people in the area, but because she had no idea what would become of Harold without someone to watch out for him. She didn't suppose that she was the world's most practical person, but since she was here, she would have to do. She still didn't particularly like him, but at least she had tried to be tactful and had turned out to have some decency, quite a bit even, in her own queer way. Harold had left her alone since their meeting 4 days ago, probably respecting her wish to grieve for her parents. But she had seen him from time to time in Ray Brannigan's Cadillac, cruising aimlessly from place to place, and twice, when the wind was right, she had been able to hear the clacking of his typewriter from her bedroom window. The fact that it was quiet enough to hear that sound, although the Lauder house was nearly a mile and a half away, seemed to underline the reality of what had happened. She was a little amused that although Harold had latched on to the Cadillac, he hadn't thought of replacing his manual typewriter with one of the quiet humming electric torpedoes. There's no electricity. Oh. Not that he could have it now, she thought as she stood up and brushed off the seat of her shorts. Ice cream and electric typewriters were things of the past. It made her feel sadly nostalgic, and she found herself wondering again, with a sense of deep bewilderment, how much a cataclysm could have taken place in only a couple of weeks. There would be other people, no matter what Harold said. If the system of authority had temporarily broken down. Oh, I thought I heard rain. If the system of authority had temporarily broken down, they would just have to find the scattered others and reform it. It didn't occur to her to wonder why authority seemed to have to be such a necessary thing to have, any more than it occurred to her to wonder why she had automatically felt responsible for Harold. It just was. Structure was a necessary thing. She left the park and walked slowly down Main Street toward the Lauderhouse. The day was warm already, and the air was freshened. I got hiccups now. Freshened by the sea breeze. She suddenly wanted to go down to the beach, find a nice piece of kelp, and nibble on it. God, you're disgusting, she said aloud. Of course she wasn't disgusting. She was just pregnant. That was it. Next week it would be Bermuda onion sandwiches with creamy horseradish on top. Ew. Those ice cream's nasty too. She stopped on the corner, although some people like it. Still a block from Harold's, surprised at how long it had been since she had thought of her delicate condition. Before, she had always been discovering that I'm pregnant thought around odd corners, like some unpleasant mess she kept forgetting to clean up. I ought to be sure and get the blue dress to the cleaners before Friday. A few more months, and I can hang it on the hang it in the closet because I'm pregnant. I guess I'll have to take my shower now. In a few months, it'll look like there's a whale in the shower stall because I'm pregnant. I ought to get the oil changed in the car before the pistons fall right out of their sockets or whatever. And I wonder what Johnny down at the Sitco would say if he knew I'm pregnant. But maybe now she had become accustomed to the thought. After all, she was nearly 3 months along, nearly a third of the way there. For the first time, she wondered, with some unease, who would help her have her baby. From behind the Lauderhouse, there came a steady, racketing click, 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 ratcheting, of a hand mower. And when Franny came around the corner, what she saw was so strange that only her complete surprise kept her from laughing out loud. Harold, clad only in a tight and skimpy blue bathing suit, was mowing the lawn. His white skin was sheened in sweat. His long hair flopped against his neck. Although, to do Harold credit, it did appear to have been washed in the not-so-distant past. The rolls of fat above the waistband of his trunks and below the leg bands bounced up and down wildly. His feet were green with cut grass to above the ankle. His back had gone reddish, although with exertion or incipient sunburn, she couldn't tell. But Harold wasn't just mowing, he was running. The Lauder's back lawn sloped down into a picturesque rambling stone wall, down to and in the middle of it was an octagonal summer house. She and Amy used to hold their teas there when they were little girls. Franny remembered with a sudden stab of nostalgia that was unexpectedly painful, back in the days when they could still cry over the ending of Sir Charlotte's Web and moan happily over Chucky Mayo, the cutest boy in school. The Lauder's lawn was somehow English in its greenness and peace. But now a dervish in a blue bathing suit was invading this pastoral scene. She could hear Harold panting in a way that was alarming to listen to as he turned the northeast corner where the Lauder's back lawn was divided from the Wilsons by a row of mulberry bushes. He roared down the slope of the lawn, bent over the mower's T-handle. The blades whirred. It's like whirled except for whir-ed. Grass flew in a green jet coating Harold's lower legs. He had mowed perhaps half of the lawn. What was left was a diminishing square about with the summer house in the middle. He turned the corner at the bottom of the hill and then roared back, for a moment obscured from view by the summer house, and then reappearing, bent over his machine like a Formula One race driver. About halfway up, he saw her. At exactly the same instant, Franny said timidly, "Harold?" and she saw that he was in tears. Huh? Harold said. Squeaked, actually. She had startled him out of some private world, and for a moment she feared that the startle on top of his exertion would give him a heart attack. Then he ran for the house, his feet kicking through drifts of mown grass, and she was peripherally aware of the sweet smell it made on the hot summer air. She took a step after him. Harold, what's wrong? Then he was bounding up the porch steps. The back door opened. Harold ran inside, and it slammed behind him with a jarring crash. In the silence that descended afterward, a jay called stridently, and some small animal made rattling noises in the bushes behind the stone wall. The mower, abandoned, stood with cut grass behind it and high grass before it, a little way from the summer house, where she and Amy had once drunk their Kool-Aid in Barbie's kitchen cups, with their little fingers sticking elegant off into the air. Franny stood indecisive for a while, and at last walked up to the door and knocked. There was no answer. She could hear Harold crying somewhere inside. Harold? No answer. The weeping went on. She let herself into the Lauders' back hall, which was dark, cool, and fragrant. Mrs. Lauder's cold pantry opened off the hall to the left, and for as long as Franny could remember, there had been a good smell of dried apples and cinnamon back here, like pies dreaming of creation. Harold? She walked up the hall to the kitchen, and Harold was there, sitting at the table. His hands were clutched in his hair, and his green feet rested on the faded linoleum that Mrs. Lauder had kept so spotless. Harold, what's wrong? Go away, he yelled tearfully. Go away, you don't like me. Yes, I do. You're okay, Harold. Maybe not great, but okay. She paused. In fact, considering the circumstances and all, I'd like to say that right now you're one of my favorite people in the whole world. That seemed to make Harold cry harder. Do you have anything to drink? Kool-Aid, he said. He sniffed, wiped his nose, and, still looking at the table, added, It's warm. Of course it is. Did you get the water at the town pump? Like many small towns, Ogunquit still had a common pump in back of the town hall, although for the last 40 years it had been more of an antiquity than a practical source of water. Tourists sometimes took pictures of it. This was the town pump in a little seaside town where we spent our vacation. Oh, isn't that quaint? It's where I got it. She poured them each a glass and sat down. We should be having it in the summer house, she thought. We could drink it with our little fingers sticking off into the air. Harold, what's wrong? Harold uttered a strange, hysterical laugh and fumbled his Kool-Aid into his mouth. He drained the glass and set it down. Wrong? Now what could be wrong? I mean, is it something specific? She tasted her Kool-Aid and fought down a grimace. It wasn't that warm. Harold must have drawn the water only a short time ago, but he'd forgotten the sugar. He looked up at her finally, his face tear-streaked, still wanting to blubber. I want my mother, he said simply. Oh, Harold. I thought when it happened, when she died, now that wasn't so bad. He was gripping his glass, staring at her in an intense, haggard way that was a little frightening. I know how terrible that must sound to you, but I never knew how I would take it when they passed away. I'm a very sensitive person. That's why I was so persecuted by the cretins at that house of horrors the town fathers saw fit to call a high school. I thought it might drive me mad with grief, their passing, or at least prostrate me for a year. My interior son, so to speak, would, and when it happened, my mother, Amy, and my father, I said to myself, now that wasn't so bad. They, he brought his fist down on the table, making her flinch. Why can't I say what I mean? He screamed. I've always been able to say what I meant. It's a writer's job to carve with language, to Hugh close to the bone, so why can't I say what it feels like? Harold, don't. I know how you feel. He stared at her dumbstruck. You know? He shook his head. No, you couldn't. Remember when you came to the house and I was digging the grave? I was half out of my mind. Half the time I couldn't even remember what I was doing. I tried to cook some French fries and almost burned the house down. So if it makes you feel better to mow the grass, fine. You'll get a sunburn if you do it in your bathing suit and trunks, though. You're already getting one, she said critically, looking at his shoulders. To be polite, she sipped a little more of the dreadful Kool-Aid. He wiped his hands across his mouth. I never even liked them that well, he said. But I thought grief was something you felt anyway. Like your bladder's full, you have to urinate. If your close relative dies, you have to be grief-stricken. She nodded, thinking that was strange, but not inept. My mother had always taken with Amy. She was Amy's friend, he amplified, with unconscious and nearby pitiful childishness. And I horrified my father. Fran saw how that could be. Brad Lauder had been a huge, brawny man and a foreman at the woolen mill in Kennebunk. He would have had very little idea of what to make of a fat, peculiar son that his loins had produced. He took me aside once, Harold resumed, and asked if I was a queer boy. That's just how he said it. I got so scared I cried, and he slapped my face and told me if I was going to be such a goddamn baby all the time, I'd best ride right out of town. And Amy, I think it would be safe to say that Amy just didn't give a shit. I was just as an embarrassment when she brought her friends home. She treated me like I was a messy room. With an effort, Franny finished her Kool-Aid. So when they were gone and I didn't feel too much one way or the other, I just thought I was wrong. Grief is not a knee-jerk reaction, I said to myself. But I got fooled. I miss them more and more every day, mostly my mother. If I could just see her, a lot of times she wasn't around when I wanted her, needed her. She was too busy doing things for Amy or with Amy. But she was never never mean to me. Oh, come on. Really? I'm sitting here reading and you gotta die. Oh, seriously? Where did it stop? Hmm. Give me a second. I have to see if this stopped. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? Don't hear the sirens? No. Yeah, it must be. Huh. What time are you picking up, John? Okay. What time are you leaving? I don't know. 9 o'clock. I'm gonna shoot my computer. I really am. I have no idea if this stopped or not. I'm giving it a minute. Yeah, now do you hear? No, I heard the garbage man though. Huh. Alright, I'll keep reading, and if it cuts it off, I'll stop at 35, and then we'll continue with 36 tomorrow. But I got fooled. I miss them more and more every day, mostly my mother. She was never mean to me. So this morning, when I got thinking about it, I said to myself, mow the grass, and I won't think about it. But I did. And I started to mow faster and faster, as if I could outrun it. What? Okay, that explains it. What? Yeah. Oh, that does explain it. As if I could outrun it, And I guess that's when you came in. Did I look crazy as I felt, Fran? She reached across the table and touched his hand. There's nothing wrong with the way you feel, Harold. Parsley root? Okay. Are you sure? He was looking at her again in that wide-eyed, childish stare. Yes. Will you be my friend? Yes. Thank God, Harold said. Thank God for that. His hand was sweaty in hers, and as she thought it, he seemed to sense it and pulled his hand reluctantly away. Would you like some more Kool-Aid? He asked more humbly. She smiled her best diplomatic smile. Maybe later, she said. They had a picnic lunch in the park, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, hostess Twinkies, and a large bottle of Coke each. The Cokes were fine after they had been cooled in the duck pond. I've been thinking about what I'm going to do, Harold said. Don't you want want the rest of that Twinkie? No, I'm full. Her Twinkie disappeared into Harold's mouth with a single bite. His belated grief hadn't affected his appetite, Franny observed, and then decided that it was rather mean way to think. What? She said. I'm thinking of going to Vermont, he said indifferently. Would you like to come? Why Vermont? There's a government plague and a communicable diseases center there in the town called Stovington. It's not as big as the one in Atlanta, but it's sure a lot closer. I was thinking if there were still people alive and working on this flu, a lot of them would be there. Why wouldn't they be dead too? Well, they might be. They might be, Harold said rather bristly. But in places like Stovington, where they're used to dealing with communicable diseases, they're also used to taking precautions. And if they are still in operation, I would imagine they are looking for people like us, people who are immune. How do you know all that, Harold? She was looking at him with more open admiration, and Harold blushed happily. I read a lot. Neither of those places are secret. So, what do you think, Fran? She thought it was a wonderful idea. It appealed to that uncoalesced need for structure and authority. She immediately dismissed Harold's disclaimer that the people running such an institution might all be dead. They would go to, they would go to Stovington. The hiccups again. They would be taken in, tested, and out of all the tests would come some discrepancy, some difference between them and all the people who had gotten sick and died. It wouldn't occur to her, just then, to wonder what earthly good a vaccine could do at this point. I think we ought to find a road atlas and see how to get there yesterday, he said. His face lit up. For a moment, she thought he was going to kiss her, and in that single shining moment, she probably would have allowed it, and then the moment passed, and in retrospect, she was glad. By the road atlas, where all distance was reduced to finger lengths, it looked simple enough. Number 1, to I-95, I-95 to US 302, and then northwest on 302, through the lake country towns of western Maine, across the chimney of New Hampshire on the same road, and then into Vermont. Stovington was only 30 miles west of Barre. Accessible either by Vermont Route 61 or I-89. How far is that altogether? Fran asked. Harold got a ruler, measured, and then consulted the mileage scale. You won't believe this, he said glumly. What is it, 100 miles? Over 300. Oh, God, Franny said. That kills my idea. I read somewhere that you could walk through most of New England states in a single day. It's a gimmick, Harold said in his most scholarly voice. It is possible to walk in 4 states, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and just across the Vermont state line in 24 hours, if you do it in just the right way. But it's like solving the puzzle where you have 2 interlocked nails. It's easy if you know how, impossible if you don't. Where in the world did you get that? She asked, amused. Guinness Book of World Records, he said disdainfully. otherwise known as the Ogunquit High School Study Hall Bible. Actually, I was thinking of bikes, or I don't know, maybe motor scooters. Harold, she said solemnly, you're a genius. Harold coughed, blushing and pleased again. We could bike as far as Wells tomorrow morning. Yeah, I got time, I think. There's a Honda dealership there. Can you drive a Honda, Fran? I can learn if you go slow for a while. Oh, I think it would be very unwise to speed, Harold said seriously. One would never know when one might come around a bend, a blind curve, and find a three-car smash-up blocking the road. No, one never would one? But why wait until tomorrow? Why don't we go today? Well, it's past 2 now, he said. We'd get much farther than Wells, and we'd need to outfit ourselves. We couldn't get much further than Wells, and we'd need to outfit ourselves. That would be easier to do here in Ogunquit because we know where everything is. And we'll need guns, of course. It was a queer, really. As soon as he mentioned that word, she had thought of the baby. Why do we need guns? He looked at her for a moment, then dropped his eyes, a red blush of creeping up his neck. Because the police and courts are gone, and you're a woman, and you're pretty, and some men, might not be gentlemen, that's why. His blush was so red now that it was almost purple. He's talking about rape, she thought. Rape. And how could anybody want to rape me? I'm pregnant. But no one knew that, not even Harold. And even if she spoke up, said to the intended rapist, will you please not do that because I'm pregnant? Could you reasonably expect the rapist to reply, geez, lady, I'm sorry, I'll go rape some other girl? Goyle. All right, she said, guns. But we could still get as far as Wells today. There's something else I want to do here, Harold said. The cupola atop Moses Richardson's barn was explosively hot. Sweat had been trickling down her body by the time they got to the hayloft. But by the time they reached the top of the rickety flight of stairs leading from the loft to the cupola, it was coursing down her body in rivers, darkening her blouse and molding it to her breast. Do you really think this is necessary, Harold? I don't know. He was carrying a bucket of white paint and wide brush with the protective cellophane still on it. But the barn overlooks US 1, and that's the way most people would come, I think. Anyway, it could hurt. It can't hurt. It will hurt if you fall off and break your bones. The heat was making her head ache, and her lunchtime Coke was sloshing around her stomach in a way that was extremely nauseating. In fact, it would be the end of you. I won't fall, Harold said nervously. He glanced at her. Fran, you look sick. It's the heat, she said faintly. Then go downstairs, for goodness sake. Lie under a tree. Watch the human fly as he does his death-defying act on the the precipice oh my gosh, precipitous precipitous 10-degree slope of Moses Richardson's barn roof. Don't joke. I still think it's silly and dangerous, yes, but I'll feel better if I go through with it. Go on, Fran, she thought. Why, he's doing it for me. He stood there, sweaty and scared, old cobwebs clinging to his naked, blubbery shoulders, his belly cascading over the waistband of his tight blue jeans, determined to not miss a bet, to do all the right things. She stood on tiptoe and kissed his mouth lightly. You be careful, she said, and then went quickly down the stairs with the Coke sloshing in her belly. Up, down, all around. Yeek! She went quickly, but not so quickly that she didn't see the stunned happiness come up in his eyes. She went down the nailed rungs from the hayloft to the straw-littered barn floor even faster because she knew she was going to puke now. And while she knew that it was the heat and the Coke and the baby. What might Harold think if he heard? So she wanted to get outside where he couldn't hear, and she made it. Just. Harold came down at a quarter to four, his sunburn now flaming red, his arms splattered with white paint. Fran had napped uneasily under the elm in Richardson's dooryard while he worked, never quite going under completely, listening to the rattle of shingles giving way and poor fat Harold's despairing scream as he fell the 90 feet from the barn's roof to the hard ground below. But it never came. Oh, listening for it. But it never came. Thank God. And now he stood proudly before her. Lawn green feet, white arms, red shoulders. Why did you bother to bring the paint back down? She asked him curiously. I wouldn't want to leave it up there. It might lead to spontaneous combustion and we'd lose our sign. And she thought again how determined he was not to miss a single beat. It was just a little bit crazy. They both gazed up at the barn roof. The fresh paint gleamed out in sharp contrast to the faded green shingles, and the words painted there reminded Fran of the signs she sometimes came upon down south, painted across barn roofs. Jesus saves, or chew red Indian. Harold's read, have gone to Stovington, Vermont Plague Center. US 1 to Wells, Interstate 95 to Portland. US 302 to Barr, Interstate 89 to Stovington. Leaving Ogunquit, July 2nd, 1990. Harold Emery Lauder, Francis Goldsmith. And he said, I don't know your middle name. And I'm going to have to stop there, but I will continue from here tomorrow. We're only like a page away from, but I have to get going. I have to go get Hubs from work. And if I'm late, he's going to be standing there. And I really don't want him standing because it's freezing out. But I have to get going. You can have my doggy. If you can handle jumping and barking. Anyway, I have to get going. Puppy will drive me crazy. Yes, Miss Thang. Can I help you, Miss Thang? Anyway, I am going to let you guys go. I appreciate y'all for being here. Did you say bye-bye? Hey, bye-bye. Hey, bye-bye. Did you show him your boo-boo? You and Mama got in a fight, huh? Two women in the same house. Not good. Blech, blech. Oh, don't punch me in the face. All right. I'm coming. I will see you guys later. Remember, I love you. Follow if you haven't. And I will see you all very, very soon. So tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock, we'll be here. Y'all have a good night. Bye.